Okay, so welcome and good afternoon, everyone. And you are in the session, Not Just the Loudest Voice in the Room, Case Studies in Oral History. I'm Lily Carroll, and I'll be moderating this session this afternoon. Before we get started and I turn it over to the presenters, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So we will utilize the Zoom chat for all presenter questions. So please feel free to use that throughout the three presentations, and I will be monitoring that, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. But please feel free to just share your questions and thoughts throughout in the chat. If you have any issues with Zoom, technical issues or otherwise, please feel free to chat me as well. You can privately chat me, and I will do my best to assist you. And I believe that is all of our housekeeping. You should see that there's a live transcription at the bottom of the screen, and we are recording this, so it will be available on demand later. And I will now introduce Jessamine Swan to introduce the rest of the group, and we look forward to this session.
All right, thank you. So oral history initiatives are currently back in vogue as institutions diversify their holdings such that they're more reflective of their actual stakeholders. This form of documentation first became popular in the latter half of the 20th century, around the same time that Howard Zinn issued his famous call for archivists to become activist-archivists. To avoid reinventing the wheel in our own outreach activities now in 2021, it's important to examine what has been done in the past, discussing our observations and ideas for how to adapt and improve upon past methods in our current postmodern, post-custodial era of practice, The speakers on this panel have performed case studies about the oral histories already housed in their archives. Our discussion will emphasize how we can plan collecting strategies that will diversify our holdings while also promoting active collaboration and relationship building with the communities from whom we're seeking to collect. So our first presenter is Nori Guthrie. She's the archivist at the Special Collections at Woodson Research Center in Bondurant Library at Rice University. She specializes in collecting and processing music materials from the Houston Folk Music Archive, which she began in 2016, as well as the Houston Blues Museum Archive. She and Scott Carlson edited Music Preservation and Archiving Today for Roman and Littlefield, published in 2018. Nori will be reviewing Rice University Special Collections oral history collections. She'll be discussing what's online, what can't go online, issues that they've faced, and reimagining ways to use oral history. Our second presenter will be Annette Becker. She serves as the director of the University of North Texas's Texas Fashion Collection, where she preserves and presents nearly 20,000 garments and accessories spanning over 250 years of fashion history. Her object-based curatorial projects and academic programming bridge scholarly and popular understandings of dress, while work towards a PhD in history has introduced digital humanities and oral history methodologies to her research. Annette will be discussing how the Texas Fashion Collection's current arrangement, presently focused as it is on designers, can be diversified to include other labor narratives as well. And I'm Jessamine Swan, the Community Engagement Archivist at Georgia College and State University. I'm currently spearheading an LGBTQ+ oral history project. I graduated from the University of Arizona with my MLIS and a graduate certificate in archival studies in May 2018. And while in Tucson, I interned at the Arizona Historical Society's Library and Archives. For my final archival studies course, I studied some of the Historical Society's oral histories and the administrative records of the Historical Society's oral history initiatives in the latter half of the 20th century. Since graduating and gaining real-world experience in archives, I've revised my graduate paper, and I'm presenting the current state of that revision here today. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Nori.
Hi, everyone. All right, just to kind of talk about what we're going to go over real quick. No, sorry, kind of mentioned just kind of an overview of what the oral histories that we have at the Woodson, what's online, what's not, and challenges and some other uses for oral histories. So in a perfect world, when we get in our oral histories, we can put them online. We want the following things: a PDF of the transcript. We want MP3 or an MP4, and if it is video, of course, we want an MP4 and an MP3, so we can use ohms on it. And if we want kind of some icing on the cake, some images are also great too. We have at the Woodson really fallen in love with OMS, created by the University of Kentucky, and it helps us sync our transcripts to the video or the audio, and then also create an index, which has also been great because if you have a really long oral history, I had one that I did that was about 5 hours, having an index is super awesome to have. Make it a little bit more palatable for people to watch it and watch what they want. So I'm going to go over some of the different oral histories that we have online at scholarship.rice.edu, which is our DSpace instance. First is the Houston Asian American Archives oral histories that are conducted in conjunction with the Chow Center for Asian Studies. It's actually, this is oral histories that are conducted by undergraduates. And as you can see, we have a lot of them, 343. This project has been going on for quite a few years. And it works like a well-oiled machine. The students take a class, they do the oral histories, we get the materials, and it's really pretty easy for us to get these online. We have one that is our most complicated via access, which is the O Project collection. What makes these complicated is that there's no video or audio that we share online. We only share a transcript that has also been redacted for reasons related to HIPAA and privacy concerns. And, but at least we have, some kind of an oral history that is there, even though there are redactions. And if someone is actually wanting to see the full oral history without any redacted material, then the O Project board actually has to approve that request. We have a group of community interviews that have popped right back, have kind of come back online. They're actually doing them again, which is the Zoroastrian community interviews. They were mainly done between 2014 and 2016, but as you can see with the date at the bottom, those have started back up again. Those are really great. We have an older set of oral histories and lectures that we have had online for quite a while, but we just had the audio files and nothing more. And that was the Chandler Davidson Texas Politics Research Collection. And what happened over the summer, because of the pandemic, we had a staff worker who was actually able to go through, Gabby Parker, and transcribe these, what ended up some of them being very difficult oral histories. And she was able to get that online, and eventually we will run kind of through the OMS process. We have a few that were done over the summer called From the Archives of the Impossible, and that is related to our paranormal collections. And they're actually interviews with these collectors of these materials, whether like ufology, other various topics. Another one that actually started recently also is the Geneva Sharp Family Pleasantville Neighborhood History Collection. And so they're they're interviews with members of the community or former members of the community of Pleasantville in Houston's neighborhood, and kind of to talk about with the residents of their lives growing up in Pleasantville, issues with environmental racism, just kind of about the community's culture. And those were mainly conducted in November, starting actually in November of 2020. And I think there's still a few to be done, and we've been getting those online recently. There's a Houston Jewish History archives that are conducted by the person who runs the Houston Jewish History Archive, which is Josh Furman. They're ones that I have worked on for the Houston Folk Music Archive. And new kind of newly started the Houston Blues Museum archive, and I hope to do more of those this year. We had a batch of oral histories that we got in from mainly from 2007 to 2015, but it's a project that has continued, that is done in conjunction with the Center for the Study of Women, Gender, and Sexuality at Rice. And there are interviews with different members of the LGBTQ community. Have an older batch of oral histories that were conducted during the Rice Women's Conference in 1996 with female alums. And actually, just to go back to that one, those were actually the first batch that we ever did OMS work for. We have ones related to the visit/non-visit of Abby Hoffman in 1970. And then we have another thing that's actually been student-led, not as part of a class, that is the COVID-19 pandemic of oral histories, students interviewing other students or people on different people who live on campus, faculty, etc. And so there's also been something that we've been getting online lately. And then other oral history projects that we have that we're working on is the Hispanic History Project Oral Histories. Those were conducted back in the 90s with alums, and I've at least sent those out to be transcribed. Still have some work to get those online. Some that are being conducted by the Task Force on Slavery, Segregation, and Racial Justice. Those are being conducted by Dr. Alex Bird and some students. And then we have a lot of things that are online and that we don't know how to put online because we don't have the paperwork for it. So we have a whole thing of our architect oral histories that cannot go online, interviews from documentaries, that, I remember one that was defunct that I worked on that was filled with interviews, but not something that could go online because we don't have releases. And so just a variety of things that we have that we're just not able to put online yet. And so to kind of circle back to some of the challenges that we've been having. So if you have noticed, there's been a lot of excitement for oral histories in this last year or two. And people love to do the oral history. They love the interview. And that is great. But there are the different steps after the interview, for example, editing the video or checking the, we will send out something to be transcribed, but then like going back through the transcript and checking the transcription. And, this has made it for us that we're really excited that we have different community partners that are wanting to do these, but that it's been a little bit more challenging for us because we're sometimes having a bit more work put on our plate of trying to get these ready to go online. And so as you can see with the, this is an example of that, this COVID-19 pandemic ones that were done by students. Right now at this point, we only just have the videos online. We don't have the PDF transcript. There's not any OMS work that has been complete. And so it's, that has kind of been a challenge that we've been working through. Again, so excited people want to make them. It's just that there are a lot of steps that we have to go through to get them online, and those aren't as exciting for people. So kind of moving on to different ways that we can use our oral histories or present them. While we, do put our oral histories in that D space through scholarship.rice.edu, it is great, but it's not as pretty. So other ways that we've tried to present these are through Omega exhibits. I've made like kind of little mini exhibits in a Houston Folk Music Archive online exhibit. And so I kind of bunch it with, we have a biography, we have images, and then an oral history. So it kind of creates like a nice little archival package for a viewer to look at. And then another thing that that came up for me is I was making a story map a few years ago, and I was running into the problem where I don't always have images of different things that are music related. For example, images of the music venues. But I remember that, I do these oral histories with people. I ask a lot of the same questions about like, oh, what places did you play? What did they look like? Can you describe them? And in those descriptions, people were able to kind of fill in those gaps. And by kind of taking those little bits of description, I was able to work that into a story map so that, even though there's not an image of the Jester Lounge, there is audio of Judy Clements of Ken and Judy describing what that place looked like, even down to the little lights that were on, or the candles that were on the tables. And so that description, those ways that, kind of thinking about our oral histories maybe in smaller chunks to kind of help us describe places or events, etc., is kind of a different, not necessarily different or groundbreaking in any way, but just kind of a different way to use them. So that is all I have. I look forward to questions at the end.
Oh, Annette, you're muted. You're muted.
Man, I feel like that's such a 2021 experience. I really appreciate Nori's presentation, Lily moderating this, and all the work that Jessamine did to organize this session. It's an honor to be with you all here today. I'm going to start out by outing myself that I am, I often describe myself as an archivist because I am running a collection of artifacts, but I'm trained as an art historian, and I'm now being trained as a historian too. So I feel like I'm in the company of people who know more about much of this than I do, and I'm excited to hear some feedback at the end with our Q&A session. So though Jessamine provided a bit of an introduction, my name is Annette Becker. I use the pronoun she, her, hers, and I'm coming to you from the University of North Texas in Denton, where I run the Texas Fashion Collection, and I've also been lucky enough to work with the UNT Oral History program, which is housed within the UNT libraries. Because I'm guessing people might not have been around our collection before, I thought I'd give a brief intro. The Texas Fashion Collection is an archive of nearly 20,000 historic and designer garments and accessories that right now we have a collection storage space on our campus, but we don't have a dedicated exhibition space. So primarily the way that people interact with our holdings is through research appointments that happen on site, often that I facilitate, or people go through the UNT Digital Library to be able to see photographs and thick descriptions of some of the artifacts in our collection. This photograph I'm sharing with you all is inside our collection storage area, which is basically the biggest, coldest closet you could possibly imagine. And it's a delightful space, but you can imagine that each one of those garments has dozens of stories it can tell, and trying to think through as an archivist how to be responsible for documenting and sharing those stories has been something I've been thinking about a lot lately. The way that our archive story kind of got started is with Neiman Marcus, the Dallas-based department store. And I think a lot of the ways that we've shaped the way our collection has functioned has kind of been through the sort of fashion industry, commercial, designer-driven lens. So some of you all might be fairly familiar with Neiman Marcus or parts of its history, that it was started in Dallas in 1907, in that, the over 114 years that Neiman's has been around. They've kind of framed themselves as selling some of the better made merchandise that's available. Today, that's really most closely associated with luxury products, and therefore usually, these heritage brands like Dior and Chanel that often don't feel very connected with the histories of everyday people. I know I don't have any Chanel in my closet. Maybe you all have lots of it. But often it's kind of a challenge to connect a lot of, our associations with Neiman Marcus today and the associations that are then kind of placed onto our collection, connecting those with sort of broader histories. So I was really excited to see that this session was happening, that this panel was happening, because in our collection, given its history, I think we do have some pretty narrow sets of voices that speak loudest in our holdings. Most of that, I think, has been determined based on the donors to our collection, because over 99% of what we have has been gifted to us, which is an incredible thing that our North Texas community has offered. But that generally means that upper class white women from the DFW area who are slightly older and are sort of tuned into the world of high fashion are the ones that have really shaped what our holdings are. So really from a donor perspective, that's kind of already limited some of the voices that get amplified in our space. But then beyond that, really because now the Texas Fashion Collection, being at the University of North Texas, is housed within the College of Visual Arts and Design, a way that art historians and artists often frame looking at our collection is really through the lens of high fashion designers, thinking about the people who have names in the backs of the garments, almost signing their garments as though they're works of art, that designers are individual creative geniuses. And really even our database, we currently use Museum Plus, kind of pushes that forward, and that one of the fields that we use is labeled artist maker. And even though any sort of creator can be put in there, anyone who is added to the meaning of that artifact, that the default starts as artist, I think, is already kind of narrowing in the ways that we're framing our pieces. Of course, that's just a database. You can search that in a million ways. But for better or worse, our collection storage area also reiterates that sort of hierarchy. So this is a shot from inside our collection storage area where our former collection manager made sort of garment hang tags to mark where different designers' pieces are being stored. As we know, there are a million ways of storing artifacts. Some institutions go by size, some go by accession number order. For better or worse, the system I've inherited really prioritizes known designer names, people like Jean-Paul Gaultier. I know far less about Thelma Gay, who is housed right next to Jean-Paul Gaultier. And in some ways, it's really exciting thinking about those two kind of holding equal space in our collection. One is an international brand now, and the other one is someone whose name has largely been lost in fashion history. But that's still kind of leaving out a lot of stories that might come up with those pieces by putting the designer first. And for better or worse, I think largely because of how our collection storage area is organized, the primary interpretive lens for our exhibitions has been focusing on designers. So in this slide on the left, we have a photograph of the catalog for the exhibition Balenciaga and His Legacy, which was celebrating arguably one of the most influential fashion designers of the 20th century, for which our collection has almost 300 examples of his work. And then on the right, we have a photograph of an exhibition that focused on Amy Zerner, who's a contemporary artist who kind of leans into the magical and occult with her textile designs. So again, there are lots of different ways that we could approach our artifacts, but historically, designers have really been pushed forward. I've been trying to gently push against some of that, and recognizing that there are a lot of people who have had literal hands in the making of pieces in our collection. And since we are really based in objects, thinking about the materiality and who's influenced that is, kind of an obvious next step in digging deeper into the interpretation and the metadata that we're creating for our artifacts. So in this slide, I have 3 quick examples. Pola Stout, who is a Polish textile designer who created textiles that were used by, for example, Gilbert Adrian, who made most of the Hollywood costume designs for Joan Crawford and Katharine Hepburn. In our database, we only had Adrian listed as a creator, and then digging more into textile design, we were able to add Pola Stout's name to more of our records and kind of amplify her voice in our archive. In the middle, we have a photograph of some black and gold embroidery that came from the embroidery house Lesage that's based in Paris. Of course, the label for this piece is for the House of Balmain, since that's the couture house that kind of sold this piece and finished its construction. But even recognizing that there are, sort of anonymous embroiderers, even working within this house, that had kind of been eliminated from this piece's history. There's a step further we can go, and hopefully even more beyond this. And then on the far right, we have a photograph of an evening dress that was created by Lily Wolfe, who has a really dynamic story that's related to the Holocaust and Miss America pageants. Honestly, I could talk to you all for 5 hours about her, but that's not what this is about. But in digging into some of the records we had for our Lily Wolfe pieces, we realized that Maddie Dreesen was the person who actually did all the pattern making and kind of constructing of the evening dresses that Lily Wolfe created as sketches. So being able to recognize that those two women kind of had, equal creative voices in that piece's creation, even if the tag in the garment said Lily Wolfe, there was still more space to kind of think about the voices that are represented. Honestly, I have wanted to push things even further because these are still really, kind of established ways to think through what voices are represented in the fashion artifacts in our collection. I've been delighted to work more closely with the UNT Oral History program, primarily because I've been working on coursework towards a PhD in history. And Dr. Todd Moy at UNT has taught some really incredible seminars on oral history methods. I've been lucky enough to take an independent study with him that I was able to kind of look at some of the oral histories that had already been executed, including one that related directly to the history of the Texas fashion collection. So there was already just one oral history kind of on the books in this program. It was a video interview speaking with some of the rag ladies, as they call themselves. They call themselves a retired apparel gals or retired apparel group, informally a group of women who basically helped create the Texas fashion collection and move it to the University of North Texas. So it was really important to kind of add their voices to our institutional history alongside Neiman Marcus. It's kind of incredible thinking that these women that worked as buyers, as fit models, in these roles, some of them don't even exist anymore in these jobs that have kind of been in large part lost to history, that in this interview, we're placing them alongside the likes of Stanley Marcus and their voices kind of shaping who the Texas fashion collection is and what we've done. But that was the only oral history interview related to our collection. So I've been working on creating a set of oral histories that relate to the Dallas fashion industry, and then creating an Omeka site to give people public access to and a little bit of an interpretive framework for thinking through what the Dallas fashion industry has looked like historically. So I've tried to be pretty transparent about the oral history methods with this, explaining, sort of methodologically what I've put into this, how I've structured it. And then I've created sort of individual bio pages for the people I've interviewed. As you all can probably guess, all of the red text are hyperlinks. I think maybe in my next slide. No, I don't have in my next slide. That all of the red links or red text are links to basically like small sections of the oral history interviews that have some metadata attached to them. As you can probably see briefly in this, I'm also working much like Nori to think through which institutions are represented too, and sort of pulling pieces of different interviews together to add thick description of what Teichgetager used to look like, or what the Zodiac room at Neiman's was like. So it's been really rewarding going through all of the steps of kind of creating and processing those oral history interviews to think through, just who we might need to add to the fashion history canon. Part of that has been really great and sort of connecting back to our physical pieces in a really direct way. So one really incredible example of that, you can kind of see represented on this page. On the far right, we have a photograph of Tracy Aker Hayes, who was one of the first international fashion reporters to work at a regional newspaper anywhere in the United States. The Dallas Morning News was one of the first regional newspaper to cover international fashion. And Tracy worked in the Dallas, doing Dallas fashion coverage for the better part of 3 decades. She wore this really incredible Ralph Lauren prairie skirt for one of her first trips to Europe to cover fashion shows. She had already donated that skirt to the Texas Fashion Collection, and you can see it in the middle photograph. We'd shared that in an exhibition that happened a few years ago. And because our collection had largely been designer oriented, we interpreted that, and putting it and mounting it on a mannequin, tried to find a whole look that Ralph Lauren would have sold with another piece that Tracy donated. But you can see that there's a pretty different way it's being represented in this photograph of her in the airport wearing a punk t-shirt. So even thinking through how we might, in the future mount some of our artifacts, having an oral history interview might be able to shape that even better because we have more information about how, the donor approached wearing that. And then that's really brought home in the interview because we talked for a little while about how she's approached her own style. So I'm going to play a short clip, not the entire 3 minutes and 53 seconds, a clip from that interview.
I know you've given part of your wardrobe to the Texas Fashion Collection, and it included some pieces that he designed. I'm curious about how, through your professional career, you've had a relationship with your wardrobe.
Oh, Annette, we can't hear the audio anymore.
Well, journalism is not a highly paid profession. And so I didn't really have a lot of disposable income to spend on clothes. I would generally I did most of my shopping in Europe and New York when I was on the road for collections. And I think having the ability to see what was coming, it gave you sort of a head start on being able to assemble your own wardrobe and in a way that was from much lower sources. The amount of designer clothes that I owned was really pretty minuscule. It was more like, the Army Navy store. And I remember trying to decide the first trip to Europe what I was going to wear to cover shows. And I didn't have that kind of wardrobe, but I decided I would kind of play up my Texasness. And it was 1980, February or March, I guess, 1980. And I wore like punk t-shirts and that Ralph Lauren prairie skirt that you have, and cowboy boots and a jacket or something, just kind of like crazy. But shopping in Europe and especially, oh my God.
Okay, well, that was about as much as I was going to share about that. I think it's really incredible with that Tracy can really tell the story of her own wardrobe. Like I mentioned, I had one way of thinking about this prairie skirt as a curator really focused on designers. She had a very different way of thinking about what that skirt had meant to her. So we're really quite lucky to be able to sort of like triangulate these sources and make sure that, even my voice as the curator isn't the one that's speaking most loudly sometimes. I kind of like being put in my place a little bit by some of these oral history narrators. I've also really been trying to think through what other voices are kind of missing in our archive. You know, Tracy as a donor to the TFC was a, you know, kind of low-hanging fruit and thinking creatively about whose voices weren't being amplified. But there are a lot of other people who have been around the fashion industry that have made a big impact, whose work is much more ephemeral and hasn't been documented and archived in the same way. So one example of that is Susan, who was one of the first sort of like larger size models that worked in the DFW area. Her interview talked a lot about parts of fashion and etiquette and self-presentation that I think are often just lost as people from those generations sort of move on or pass away. So in thinking through how we might be able to present our garments and accessories in the future, it's exciting to be able to think about people in the future hearing her voice, describing the ways that people carried themselves and how that was sort of formalized. And I'm looking forward to pushing this even further, that there are a lot of people who weren't the first big flashy thing in their field, you know, especially people who are physically making garments that, you know, where they're working is not a place that people see. You know, sometimes the manufacturers are not even noted when garments are made, let alone the name of the designer. So I know there's a lot of space for us to keep pushing forward. And I really appreciate that there are archivists like you all who are providing some encouragement and support and helping ask bigger questions, so that we don't just sit with fashion as a pretty thing, but think through what deeper meaning it can have to our communities. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Annette. This was really interesting. So I have a video for my presentation. Before I share it, let me see. I'm just going to post the link in the chat just in case we have to cut it short for time. Let's see. All right. Like many similar institutions, the Southern Arizona Division of the Arizona Historical Society actively participated in the cultural moment of civil unrest following Zinn's famous 1970 speech at the annual SAA meeting regarding activist-archivists. My presentation today will examine 3 brief case studies of oral history collections, both accessioned and actively created at the Arizona Historical Society throughout the 1980s and 90s, exploring how issues of what psychoanalysts call captation and self-indexing hampered late 20th century oral history initiative design and execution. As it is not uncommon to find oral history initiatives today which resemble these cases in one way or another, it is instructive to inspect these cases and consider what postmodern changes can be enacted in order to improve upon past professional efforts. According to psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan, our worlds are full of mirrors, and we are compulsively looking for our own reflection, a specular image, everywhere in it. We prefer to see ourselves in fragments rather than large slices. Psychoanalysts Edouard Pichon and Odile Cadet call the simultaneous anxiety, capture, and fascination, captivation, that the specular image arouses in us, captation. We don't want to see ourselves, but we can't stop looking. In addition, when we make the mistake of revealing to others just what it is we are looking for or at, they can potentially wield the mirror's captivating power against us. Near the middle of Kurt Vonnegut's Cat's Cradle, Claire Minton, a former professional indexer, warns John, the novel's journal's protagonist, never index your own book. Minton claims to be able to use a given book's index to locate not only the biases and values that an author has unknowingly written into their book, but also the general character of the author. To Minton, an index constructed by the book's author is a mirror of the author's intentions, giving the reader access to the way in which the author has constructed the story. Like the self-reflection Ham might not have seen looming large in his mirror, Minton's self-index captures not only the world of the book, but also the way in which the author's presence haunts that world. When John asks Minton to tell him what she sees in a particular index, Minton says evasively, "Things I'd better not tell strangers," as if she understands how impossible it is to hold up a mirror to others without also capturing something of one's own reflection. By refusing to share her knowledge with John, she resists the impulse towards her own captation, an impulse that could make her just as vulnerable as an author's self-indexed book has left them. She resists the glittering, fragmentary self-reflections, the shameful exhibition, as she puts it. For our purposes today, I'm considering the book indexer in this particular sense as performing work analogous to the appraisal and processing duties of the archivist, particularly the archivist who is also coordinating oral history efforts. The archivist, too, faces challenges related to both captation and self-indexing. Milo Wilbanks, a self-professed cowboy poet, created reel-to-reel recordings of interviews with his neighbors in rural Aker, Arizona in the late 1950s. Todd Mills processed them for the Arizona Historical Society beginning in 1979. Wilbanks does not question or otherwise engage at all with his narrators. He gives an introduction about them, but then lets them talk. The recordings suffer from the lack of interactions, as narrators often wander from topic to topic, losing enthusiasm as they self-consciously try to prompt some sign of interest from their largely stoic interviewer. Mills does not prepare transcripts of Wilbanks' interviews. Rather, he prepares indexes and notes composed of dry empirical statements of fact and data points. He extracts information like employment, family relationships, marriages, deaths, schools attended, geographical locations, and meals. There's a particular tendency to gravitate towards numerical amounts. No attempt is made to document things like sensory details or emotional affect, or nonverbal communications like laughs, pauses, etc. Assigning importance to this kind of information arguably serves the same purpose as the genealogies and title papers that once documented the family lines of French nobility, until such records were burned during the French Revolution, of course. Counting how many children Aker, Arizona's mailman had, for example, and holding that number up against his salary, in addition to noting that he had never moved more than 10 miles from his birthplace, tells a researcher nothing about whom the mailman really was. The only thing such information really indicates is the mailman's lower socioeconomic status. The result of the numerous erasures happening in the oral histories is a pervading sense of anonymity that belies the express purpose of collecting and processing histories from ordinary men, and betrays the conservative value system that serves to uphold the status quo. Wilbanks and Mills evade captation, but they fail to allow the little corner of the world for which they had hoped to hold up a mirror to see itself reflected in their efforts. Had they dared to look at themselves, perhaps they would have realized that the methods that they were using were at odds with their goals. There were so many things that they had decided that they had better not tell strangers, that they literally and figuratively ended up saying nothing. Paranoiac knowledge is Lacan's term for paradoxical self-awareness. The more paranoiac knowledge a person has, the greater their understanding of the extent to which they cannot explain their own thoughts and actions. More paranoiac knowledge leads an individual to feel haunted by a sense that there is an other influencing them in ways that they can detect but cannot explain or control. The original goal of the Tucson Railroaders Project was to collect reminiscences of railroad personnel and Armory Park residents who were associated with the Southern Pacific Transportation Company over the last 50 years, according to Karen Mangelsdorf, who appears to have headed up the project in the early 1980s. Mangelsdorf's initiative is an instance in which the oral history record is not interpreted as the documentary record itself, but rather as source material from which the primary written record, the transcript, is actively shaped by an oral history coordinator working on behalf of an archive. Unlike Wilbanks and Mills, Mangelsdorf did document her processing activities to some extent within AHS's administrative files, which are not open to public view. Examining Mangelsdorf's records in accordance with the oral histories that she processed reveals the paranoiac self-indexing that she inadvertently engaged in as she attempted to efface herself and other interviewers entirely from the documentary record. Paradoxically, her presence within the record is given away by her marked absence. Mangelsdorf uses opening tags prior to each interview that are, unlike Wilbanks' introductions, recorded prior to her sitting down with her narrators. She takes an academic approach to the interviews, adhering to a predetermined list of questions and asking follow-up questions only as a matter of courtesy, often leaving these interactions out of the final transcript entirely. She is single-minded regarding her question topics and fastidious in her cold reshaping of the interview transcripts. She removes pleasantries, leaves out nonverbal information, corrects grammar, and omits anything that is not immediately relevant to her question list. The goal appears to be to produce a tightly structured, information-dense narrative from which Mangelsdorf has erased her own presence. The actual effect, however, is that the transcript reads as a cold, awkward, impersonal, and rather obviously severed from the organic whole of the interview. The tag beside Mangelsdorf's parts of the interviews does not say her name, but rather reads AHS, further erasing humanity from the record. Because of the heavy hand that Mangelsdorf applies in editing, there is an extent to which all the narrators begin to have similar sounding responses, even if their narratives have different content. In apparently attempting to increase the accessibility and utility of her narrator's stories, Mangelsdorf approaches them with the same soullessness that would be expected of a Jenkinsonian devotee of truth. She is, however, foiled by her own captation. Though clearly well-intentioned, she proceeds to often figuratively butcher precisely what it is she seeks to preserve. Without the context provided by Mingelsdorf's administrative records, which include documents like correspondence and marked up verbatim transcripts, the interviews from the Railroaders Project read as much handled pastiches of conversation that are a step above Mill's dry indexes, but a bit uncanny in the odd pattern of absences and almost possessive presences. The administrative records, however, allow Mingelsdorf's fingerprints to be identified, and we can arguably see nothing so vibrant and so compellingly true as all the glittering fragments of her reflected self, scattered throughout the transcripts. Broken, yet as sharp to the eye as real glass is to the touch, her presence cuts through again and again. AHS hired Lynn Papanikolaou as an oral history coordinator sometime in the late 80s or early 90s. Among other projects, she spearheaded medicine and healthcare delivery in southern Arizona, an initiative inspired by the Baylor Medical College of Medicine's oral history program. An advisory board composed of medical professionals, evidently chosen by the Pima County Medical Society, who collaborated with AHS on the project, essentially ran the project, with Papanikolaou acting as their liaison within AHS. The board determined what topics would be covered and selected narrators based on whether their medical expertise and experience could, quote, fill a gap in the documentation available about a specific time period or medical specialty. The board had also actively raised a total of $33,000 in funds for AHS's oral history program by the end of the project. Like Mingelsdorf, Papanikolaou conducted many of the interviews in the project that she was running herself. However, unlike Mingelsdorf, she's a markedly emotive interviewer. Papanikolaou does not rigidly structure her interviews, nor does she ever attempt to rein in her narrators to a particular area of focus. She frequently asks spontaneous follow-up questions and encourages her narrators to follow their natural associative trains of thought. Unlike Mingelsdorf, Papanikolaou largely left it to her narrators to shape their own verbatim transcripts into final drafts, noting in the forward place before each transcript how the narrators, quote, in some cases, edited extensively. Papanikolaou also creates indexes for each transcript that contain a thorough mixture of biographical details and medical topics, which were then sent for approval and correction to narrators, along with their verbatim transcripts. Finally, in front of each transcribed interview, Papanikolaou composes a narrator biography, written in the tone of a speech one might give to introduce a keynote speaker. Papanikolaou makes no attempts to efface herself from the documentary records that she facilitates. Her name appears beside each contribution that she makes, including within the transcripts as dialogue text. She retains all her correspondence with her narrators and even keeps detailed notes about her interactions with them. She keeps copies of every draft of the transcripts, clearly differentiating those that she edits from those edited by her narrators. Indeed, her documentation within AHS's administrative records is the most thorough documentation of all three case studies presented here and makes the appraisal and processing decisions associated with this collection quite transparent. Despite the fact that Papanikolaou makes no attempt to hide, she quite effectively disappears into the background of her project. At first glance, it might appear that Papanikolaou is successfully utilizing postmodern methods of appraisal and processing to the end of attaining an unobtrusive presence in the records that she is facilitating. But this is not accurate. Rather, Papanikolaou simply does not face the same issues tackled by Wilbanks, Mills, and Mingelsdorf before her. She avoids these problems because the narrators themselves are controlling the major decisions of the project. These were not the narratives of Zinn's ordinary men and women that, as Lynn Abrams has observed, exist in fragments that the interviewer must help the narrator to stitch into coherent, meaningful wholes. Papanikolaou's narrators were highly educated medical professionals with the time, inclination, articulation, and experience necessary to communicate the version of themselves that they most wanted to see preserved in Arizona history. Papanikolaou does not so much co-create as she does facilitate, bypassing, not solving, the problem that the archives-led oral history initiatives in particular pose. In fact, she ends up reverting to a notable extent to the traditional custodial role of keeper of the records of the powerful, wealthy, and highly literate upper class. Of course, it is only possible to identify Papanikolaou's lack of fingerprints on this project because of her extensive, unapologetic self-indexing. She did not and could not reveal the full extent of the complex, polished, and practiced storytelling undertaken by her narrators. However, it is worth noting that because of her efforts, AHS was actually able to capture slivers of the record creator's processes, which is a rare get. Papanikolaou's appraisal and processing work in the medical and healthcare delivery project is instructive with regards to dealing with issues of self-indexing and captation, precisely because Papanikolaou proceeds to do the former of her own accord, as opposed to self-indexing compulsively subsequent to falling victim to captation. She chooses to index herself, precluding any distracting erasures from marring the final product. Any archivist come oral history coordinator must accept the inevitabilities of self-indexing if we are to minimize the dangers posed by captation in our work. We cannot prevent ourselves from appearing in the records we co-create, as Wilbanks and Mills attempt, nor can we cut ourselves out as Mingelsdorf tries to do. The answer is not either to nostalgically seek that same comfortable invisibility achieved by Papanikolaou, who is dwarfed by the ruling class that will, when invited, move to fill that space in the mirror that so fascinates and terrifies us. Rather, we must thoroughly seek to document our presence in the initiatives that we run. In my opinion, the general recommendations made by Michelle Light and Tom Hyrie and colophons and annotations is a good place to start to begin planning the self-indexing process. Interviewees and anyone else with a key role in shaping the final records should have their own biographical information, if not their own oral history, made available both to potential narrators and within the final process collection. However, rather than appear as a call-upon within the finding aid as recommended by Light and Hyrie, I argue that this information should be included in a separate administrative series within the collection itself. The decision places the co-creators side by side within the collection, communicating more clearly that co-creation rather than singular creation is taking place. In so doing, it removes the authority implied in the decision to put the archivist biography in the body of the finding aid, making it more clear that any researchers who come to the collection will need to determine the extent to which each archivist, interviewer, and narrator has contributed to a given record. In addition, all correspondence should be kept, and a journal containing project activities should be faithfully maintained. Generally speaking, all administrative files that are heretofore kept restricted from public access should, to the extent possible, be made publicly available. As I've demonstrated here, they contain valuable contextual information that almost certainly changes the way a researcher would view the transcripts or hear the interview recordings. To this end, an informal record schedule of sorts should be implemented in the managing of oral history projects in order to ensure some degree of uniformity, consistency, and sustainability among projects hosted by the same institution. It should be determined and made clear to those contributing to the project what documentation is destined for the archives, how that documentation should be completed and maintained during its active life, and when its active life will be over, and how one goes about moving said documentation into the archive at the appropriate time. Finally, it should mean not only medical doctors who have agency over their own image. Archivists cum oral history coordinators should make themselves and their skills available as resources to all our narrators, providing them with whatever services they need from us. In this sense, Mankelsdorff's heavy hand was not necessarily wrongly applied, as it was incorrectly applied. Particularly when our narrators are among the marginalized and forgotten that most need oral history initiatives to be heard, we should lay our hands on their records as much as is needed in order to apply our expertise to shape our narrators' oral histories to their satisfaction. Whatever the ways in which our narrators determine we ought to shape the records that come to us, we must also ensure that we keep their untouched originals at hand and document our every fingerprint and theirs as exhaustively as we are able. Perhaps this will mean that we will feel less like historians and biographers or even creative nonfiction writers in future years. I would note that it is with this consideration in mind that I made the choice in proposing my present LGBTQ+ focused initiative to term it an oral memoir rather than an oral history project. It is not possible to both produce something meaningful and avoid captation. There is therefore no use in allowing ourselves to dwell on what things we had better not tell strangers. There will be a Derridian sort of violence. The most we can do is try to document the violence that we will not be able to prevent committing against both ourselves and our holdings. It's only by surrendering our fingerprints in this way that we can ensure that those examining the records that we've been charged with will be able to perform the needed forensics on the crime scenes we leave behind. We must help them solve the mystery of what we have done, so they can surmount it to find something of the things that we so wanted to preserve. Thank you. All right, that's all I have.
Thank you so much. If that is our 3 presentations, if everyone would like to join in a virtual round of applause for Jessamine, Annette, and Nori, thank you so much. You can use little chat reactions or thumbs up, whatever you feel. We have a few minutes for some Q&A. If anyone has any questions they'd like to submit, we had one question in the chat, but it looks like Annette answered that. And so if anyone has any other questions, please feel free to you're welcome to unmute and ask the question yourself or put it in the chat and I will field them.
Well, I had kind of a thought after listening to Jessamine's presentation. I think in oral history, the idea of shared authority gets thrown around pretty frequently as Michael Frisch has presented it. And I really appreciate being in a group of archivists, seeing how like you all are kind of thinking through the active role that you all have and the authority that you're kind of inserting into these projects too. So it's exciting to think through that from my perspective too, as a person conducting the oral histories and trying to figure out how to process them. With the website I've put together, I've tried to even include links to some of the emails that I've sent soliciting the interviews, if only because being a doctoral student and an archive director, it can be hard for people to know who's interviewing them. So that you've thought through this in a far more poetic way, I really appreciate.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was difficult to write.
Yeah, it was really fantastic. I'll ask a question if no one has one at this point. Just maybe if you each want to touch a little bit on the sort of staffing that you have at your institutions to support you in doing these projects.
I guess I'll go first. Basically, you know, there are 5 of us who are the archivists at the Woods Inn, and then there are some other part-time staff, and we've been able to, you know, so the one that we've really been dealing with the longest are those archives, and as I said, those things are a well-oiled machine. Amanda Foki worked really hard with the Chow Center to, you know, kind of so that all the students kind of have all the things that they need when they submit and whatnot. And so that hasn't really been that much work. It's, you know, the ones that we've had recently that have been a bit more. And so different ones of us here kind of are dealing with those different oral histories. But I'm actually the only one who's really been conducting any oral histories.
See, well, for what it's worth at the Texas Fashion Collection, I'm the only permanent staff person here. We've been able to generate funds to keep between 1 and 6 part-time people around, but generally they're students and cycle through nearly every semester. With the UNT Oral History program, I'm under the impression that it has 1 full-time sort of administrative staff who does a lot of the processing files and creating some of the metadata, and that's supported by a history program faculty member whose service is involved with that program. But of course, that's kind of leaving out the, you know, massive staff at the UNT libraries, and even, you know, the IT department within my college, and the people who maintain the facilities that we're in. So, you know, I feel like that's a question that can kind of spiral out of control, but trying to figure out how, like, what sort of labor to put towards an oral history project. It's largely been supplemental through my role as a PhD student, because quite frankly, there are so many other responsibilities I have as the director of this archive.
Well, there's 3 of us here at Georgia College. There's 3 archivists, and we have variable funding for student assistants. I don't think we had any graduate assistant funding this year. So we had 4 undergraduate assistants. Last year we had 2 graduate assistants and I think 2 undergrad. So it's mostly me working on the oral history, this particular one. And it's me and another archivist working on, we're doing the history of Central State Hospital, which was Georgia's mental asylum back in I think it closed about 10 years ago. We do have another girl, she's over in circulation, that sometimes she's really interested in oral history, so she kind of volunteers her time to this. And we're hoping that we can maybe recruit volunteers from the community that would be interested in interviewing other community members.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all so much. We're at 4 o'clock, so we will close our session. If anyone has questions, you know, you're welcome, and we can follow up after, but thank you so much to our presenters. And the next thing on the session and the SSA scheduled is the welcome reception at 4 o'clock, so starting right now. So go ahead and head over there. And thank you everyone for joining us. It's been really fascinating to hear from each of you, so thanks.